Welcome, and this is wonderful to have you. This is a starting shot of what we plan to be regular meetings for the Now Generation group, and also interaction between you and the board, because it's really important to strengthen this relationship among yourselves and among the elder guys like us also, because we need to understand each other much better. And today as well, I mean, we're going to be focusing on the issue, of course, of Corona. And there are going to be really three areas we're going to look at. One will be what's happening, what is the challenge this virus caused for Africa. This discussion will be led by Jay, and then we're going to have a second element about the responses. Graça will be leading that one.
Yes.
Okay, and then Jendayi will lead the discussion on the future, where to go from here. So it is like three streams of discussion. But before we start the discussion, first I would like to invite, I'm going to introduce our team, the elders guys, and then I will invite you to introduce yourselves. Let me introduce our team then. I mean, if I start, I see Jay here. Jay is a leading South African revolutionary, if I may call him so, if you don't mind. He's a man who founded the trade union movement in South Africa, COSATU, and after liberation, he became the minister for rural development under Nelson Mandela and Mandela's government. After Mandela, he decided not to stay in government, and he became the chairman of the South African Development Bank. And I guess after that, Jay became a little bit disenchanted with the ANC, like all of us. And you decided to set your store a little bit outside the ANC, and you have the Maverick, which is a wonderful platform, which you contributed to founding. He writes a lot, and he is also focused on the issue of young people in South Africa. I think that maybe summarize the background of Jay. Then we have Jendayi Frazer. Jendayi, is an African American. She was ambassador to the US in South Africa during the wonderful days of the past when US used to be around in Africa. And she became Assistant Secretary of State for Africa. She was really overseeing what's going in Africa. And then after that, she was teaching at the university. She was a CEO business. And for us also, it's very important that she's not only on the board, but she's also the officer in charge of the our fellowship program. And as such, she's very much involved also with young people and their aspirations. Last but not least, Graça. I don't think I'm not going to say anything about Graça because all of you should know everything about her. You guys call her Mama Graça. And given that I'm older than her, I cannot call her Mama Graça. I call her my young sister. I think that's our team. You guys now introduce yourselves to us, please, one by one. Okay, Carl, you start, yeah?
Yes, Carl Manlan, Mo Ibrahim Fellow in the office of Dr. Carlos Lopez at the Economic Commission for Africa. I'm currently working at Ecobank Foundation for the past 4 years as the Chief Operating Officer, and I'm from Côte d'Ivoire. Thank you for having me.
Hi, Natasha Kimani, Mo Ibrahim Fellow, 2017 Chatham House. Currently the Head of Partnerships and Programs at Shujaz Inc. From Nairobi, Kenya.
Hi, my name is Hanan Taifour.
and I'm from Sudan, and I'm currently the Mo Ibrahim Fellow with placement at the International Trade Center in Geneva.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mandipa and Ndlovu. I am Zimbabwean. I was a Mo Ibrahim Scholar at SOAS 2017-2018. I just finished my teaching tenure at the University of Cape Town, and I'm on my way to Leiden to pursue a PhD. So,
wonderful. Okay, thank you very much. I really invite Jay to start his first slots, and I think now we have like 18 minutes each to keep our time. Jay, you run your session the way you like it, and you are in charge now. Thanks.
Thanks, Mo, and thank you to all that are present on this conference call. I'm in quarantine because for the last 4 months I was caught in the lockdown in a ashram and a yoga center in India, which was a life-changing experience for me. But I think that, as we see from the survey, things have changed forever. I think the talk about going back to the old normal is not going to be possible. We cannot even anticipate whether it's going to be a second or third wave that hits us. But I think what we are looking at in terms of the survey and yourselves is that a lot of what needs to happen lies in the hands of the next generation, which is y'all. And you cannot be leaders of tomorrow. In fact, the urgency is for you all to be leaders of today. And I realized, particularly from the last 4 months, that my ignorance is much greater than my knowledge. And the board of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation and these networks serve convening for ideas to be heard in the right places of power. But a lot of it has to be from the bottom up, because governments are not looking at innovative solutions anymore. So I think that for me, the 3 key issues is how we're looking at the economic and social challenges through a lens of the environmental emergency that we face. And I think that's really important. And we're looking at agriculture, we're looking at green energy, we're looking at any of the interventions. How can we prioritize that? The second, I think, is very much about the violence that we are going to see, the increased violence against women, against the planet, against children. And how do we create a harmony and relationship between the role of men and the role of women as we try to create a way in which we live more consciously going to the future. And lastly, I think we are going to see a pandemic of mental illnesses, depression, anxiety, suicide. I think a lot of that will result in violence like we are seeing here in South Africa, but it's not unique, it's across the world. And so how does one develop the skills and tools for that inner awareness so that we build up not just our health systems and our immune systems, but our capacity mentally to be able to deal with the challenges that we are going to be facing in the future. And I think in this context, I think the questions that I really want to present to you all is, first of all, was it really unexpected? Are we surprised about the challenges that particularly focus on the economic and social, spheres? The second is, Sub-Saharan Africa, as we've known, has always been the epicenter of hunger. And how will this crisis change our view on how Africa can really look at a different way of building an agricultural model that is consistent with not breaching the planetary boundaries that we have, that is ecological, agroecology. And lastly, I think in the context of gender violence that we see in a scaling of, it's not just the role of governments, but what is the role of NGOs, of, like you're saying, faith-based groups, of individual networks such as the Now Generation. So I think if I could just say in the next 10 minutes, if each of you could just spend 5 minutes each commenting on that, and then perhaps give an opportunity to others to input if they have other views to add to what you say. So I hand over to Mandipa and Hanam.
Thank you so much, Jay, for really outlining the key issues as you see them. And definitely, it's unsurprising because, given that 95% of all respondents cited unemployment, increased food insecurity, and gender-based violence as the three main economic and social impacts of COVID-19. And I'm taking this also as well with a survey that the Relaunching Africa series has been doing. So the Relaunching Africa series is basically an online platform that has been surveying the same kinds of issues, but looking at how technology can best overcome these. We've looked at 20 young experts, of which 17 of them are now Generation Network members. So, when we ask the question, why is food insecurity only now being realized as a major challenge? I think coupled with the worst locust outbreak of the past 25 years, so COVID-19 has firstly reduced the buying power of citizens, and the 2020 report, the global report on food crises, revealed that 73 million out of the 135 million food insecure people in the world live in Africa, and that's really worrying, considering that 60% of our jobs on the continent are in the agricultural sector. When you talk about the coronavirus itself, nutrition coupled with access to sanitation. I mean, Afrobarometer speaks about 4 in 10 homes have access to a steady supply of water and sanitation on any given day. And that's shocking across Africa. So really the ripple effects of food insecurity that we've seen in terms of challenges is the informalized trading markets in terms of exposure. You're seeing livelihoods versus lives. So people are more in contact with each other in Africa because of the informality of our employment space. The prematuring of opening our economies to allow that sustenance of livelihoods as well has been a serious problem. And opening schools where food is served to young, to children, to school-going children, just to ensure that food security as well, are all serious governance issues that we need to be looking at and that we need to be dealing with on the continent. So in the conversations that we've had in the Relaunching Africa series, we had a conversation with the co-founder and the coordinator of Nourishing Africa. So that's an initiative that's come out of Sahel Consulting, where Ndidi Nuneli is a managing partner. And again, we are not on track to being self-sufficient. And when I say we, I talk about the African continent generally. We're not on track to making ourselves self-sufficient and a net exporter in the next 30 years as we had hoped to. When we spoke to the representative from Nourishing Africa, key infrastructural issues like electricity at the basic level. She cited that 60% of the food being grown on African farms either soils or can't be produced because of a lack of electricity. And that's an infrastructural issue. That's a governance issue. That's a disinvestment in governance. When you speak about big data, a lack of tracking production, a lack of big data, and the impediments it has on tracking production flows still affects agricultural management and chain management of agriculture, which has been exacerbated by the coronavirus, which has disrupted supply chain management. And when you talk about agriculture and entrepreneurs or agri-entrepreneurs on the continent, in terms of investing in ourselves, when as an investor, you look in a space where there is no electricity, you're unlikely to invest, or in unstable electricity or unfavorable government policies, you're unlikely to invest. But even where there is electricity, there's the added problem of connectivity. So only 66% of Africans are online, but even then, it's not great network. So how do we bridge that in order to allow technology to be dispersed to agri-entrepreneurs? What was cited as well is a lot of the businesses or agri-businesses that have survived given COVID were businesses or entrepreneurs that had innovation already ingrained in their business model. When we talk about concerns of gender-based violence, in his last address, President Cyril Ramaphosa, said that South Africa is facing a double pandemic. So not only is South Africa facing COVID-19, and it's no secret that the socioeconomic outcomes of the COVID-19 pandemic on young people have also been gendered. And I know many, including Mama Graça Machel, have spoken to this as well. It's really about an issue of governments revisiting legislation, civic education, citizen-centric governance, and recommitting to empowering grassroots communities and civil society organizations already doing the work on the ground. When you talk about the exacerbation of gender-based violence, during the lockdown, most abusers are in the home. In Zimbabwe, my home country, within the first 11 days of lockdown, 764 intimate gender-based violence cases were reported in the first 11 days. So we can only now imagine what those numbers look like. I mean, in South Sudan, where you're talking about mass cash transfers, allowing girls to keep learning from, being dispersed to allow girls to keep learning from home, to cater for the socioeconomic challenges. A lot of people on the ground that we've spoken to, or that I've spoken to, are not sure if that cash is being used for what it's meant to be used for. Is it being appropriated? Is it being, distributed in the right channels? So it's these are the issues and the challenges that are currently on the ground. But I'll leave it there, and if anyone wants to build on that or rebut, yeah.
Thanks very much, Mandipa. Hanam, can we have your input on this?
Yeah, I'll follow up on a lot of what Mandipa is saying. Yes, there's a huge crisis on the African continent, and the impact of the COVID pandemic began to hit African economies even before, the virus reached the shores. There were so many issues in terms of falling demand for African commodities, capital flight. There was collapse in tourism. It really disturbed supply chains all over Africa and all over the world, and it shows how much supply chains are interconnected. Although African countries moved swiftly and enforced really severe lockdown measures to mitigate the extent of the lockdown, it's had a huge, profound effect in terms of socioeconomic issues such as gender-based violence and people unemployment. And these issues are only going to be exacerbated as we reconcile with the health crisis. We're going to be left to confront a really severe, deep global recession that's going to impact Africa the most. I think it's very important to focus on those in the informal sector who make up a huge proportion of the African economy, and these are the people who have not been provided with support during this crisis. Social protection plays a huge crucial role in this element, and I don't think it's been utilized enough in this context. In South Africa, I know that the government used the Mother and Child Cash Grant to extend additional support, and I think this is like a really important facility that can be used going forward, and hasn't been deployed to the full extent that it can. And it's a way to also help with providing a basic social floor while also providing an income and giving nutrition to the mother and child and also the family and the household. So just providing that basic social floor, I think that's something that's really missing in the African context especially. Also, remittances are a huge factor that had caused, disruptions to the economy and socioeconomic factors. They play a huge source of income and support for many households in Africa, and they're projected to decline heavily. In some countries, they make up as 10% of GDP. So not having these remittances flows is going to have a huge economic impact. In terms of food and agriculture, there's definitely a food crisis that will hit the African continent. Despite having many natural resources in Africa, there are many countries that are net importers of agricultural food and products, and the pandemic is only going to escalate this food crisis, especially as Africa is a large rice consumer and it imports a lot of this product. So it really places an emphasis on Africa being self-sufficient and investing in manufacturing and agriculture and supply chains to be more self-sufficient going forward. And I think a large part of that has to do with looking forward, the African Continent Free Trade Agreement, which was supposed to be implemented in July 2020 this year, but unfortunately it's been postponed to the pandemic. And I think this is a way to alleviate some of the challenges that Africa faces in terms of investments, in terms of trade, in terms of supply chains, in terms of economic stability. It really focuses on addressing infrastructure efficiency. It also focuses on, improving trade logistics between countries and spurring regional trade, and also focusing on empowering and providing financial access to small, medium-sized entrepreneurs, which are the bread and bone or the backbone of African economies and support so much to GDP going forward. So going forward, once it's implemented, I think this will have a profound effect on Africa. And also, a large component of it looks into the way technology can be deployed for productivity growth and reducing barriers to trade and providing companies with new production techniques and knowledge and access to market information. And I think this is a solution going forward that will help Africa recover from the recession that it's going to face, unfortunately. In terms of gender-based violence, Mandy touched on a lot of points, and I'm currently in South Africa, and at the moment, I read a statistic where a woman is murdered every 3 hours, which is just horrific. And it just shows that even despite the statistics, the majority of gender-based violence issues are not even reported. So the gravity and the magnitude of this issue is so extreme, and it's so important to address the issues that women face. And once some of the ways that these interventions can be adapted includes providing, expanding services and shelters and spaces, promoting gender-based violence health systems, and even women who, once they experience these issues, building economic resilience of these gender-based violence survivors. So for instance, giving them cash transfers, training facilities to really empower them so that they're not dependent on going back to the same destructive cycle. And I would like to see just more being done in this space, because at the moment it's being treated as a health crisis, but not enough attention is being paid to the gender dynamics, which have a profound impact. As we all know, women's economic empowerment is a huge driver of economic growth, and going forward, I'd love to see more emphasis put on this space.
And, thank you. Thank you so much. We've got literally 2 minutes left. And I think one of the big challenges we face in Africa is we are dependent on our governments, but there's a huge liquidity crisis. Many of our governments are completely bankrupt and are searching to try and improve their liquidity in terms of borrowings. And so that's a crisis. I mean, in South Africa now, hospital beds are all taken in Gauteng. No more hospital beds left. So these crises will deepen. I suppose the question for us as we go on with the discussion is, how do we as citizens play our role in coming back to the principle of Ubuntu, that if my neighbor is ill, it's my responsibility to take care of them? And how do we start to create those networks, solidarity networks that were inherent in the culture and indigenous cultures of Africa, because we're going to have to depend on each other. And that's the question you have to ask yourselves in our generation. You are 250, but we need 2.5 million of you active and doing something in the community. Then you have to ask yourselves, what are the skills you need in order to earn a living, to build your livelihood, but also to play a role in keeping the social cohesion? Because in the absence of food or healthcare or education, the natural tendency is for violence. How do we maintain peace in our communities? And that's a central question for young people across the world. And I think maybe we end on that, and let's see if we can pick that up in the rest of the conversation. So thank you, Mo, and
thank you very much. Thank you, Jay. And I think we invite now my sister Graça to lead the discussion on the next slides. Please, Graça, you want to take over?
Thank you, Mo, and thank you, young people, for the previous discussion. We listened very carefully, and the way I would like to suggest we carry on with our discussion. One is, we know of all the problems and insufficiencies and lack, or perhaps lack of kind of adequate response from governments. But I would like you to be more specific in these discussions now. One, what is really what you feel as the gaps in the response which governments at the national level, perhaps regional economic communities, and African Union, and yes, of course, you can also mention what is happening globally, is what are the real gaps of response you feel are to be dealt with, and we would like to have your insights on that. The second question I'd like you also in your discussions to address is, what do you think we should do? To be much more concrete, and not only to ask questions, how do we do this? Well, who is going to respond? You young people are being given a space and a platform by the foundation. One, to have your views, expressed clear and loud, with no limitations of expressing yourself. To have that space, that platform. The foundation is giving you as well an opportunity to see how do you strengthen your network, because one person can do what you can, but as a collective, you can do even better. So the foundation is giving you an opportunity to build a strong network through which then the voice of one will be multiplied in 500 times, and it becomes much stronger. And of course, it will become much more effective when you address, those who are decision makers. So how do you see strengthening this network? The third one is, we are aware that there's a lack of connection and productive, meaningful connection between you young people, organized as you might be, but with the decision-making bodies, or if you like, elected bodies, but even with the business bodies. So tell us in your comments here, how do you see the foundation in this case facilitating the connection between these young people, organized, brilliant, with very, very creative ideas, then to influence the current decision-making bodies? Because at the end of the day, it is the entry point for you to take charge of this Africa of ours. To influence, but more than influence, to transform the institutions which do exist. That's why, for instance, Mo has opened the scholars to be at African Development Bank, to be at ECA, all these bodies. It's because you have not only to know how they operate, but now it is how to transform them to become the Africa you want more than us, because we are old, but you young people, the Africa you want. So please make your comments in terms of adequacy of the response, but more importantly, tell us the gaps and how do you see yourself influencing, transformation, and how you see the foundation facilitating the entry point through which at national, at REX, at African Union, and even at global level, you have the face and the voice of African young people influencing change. And I'm asking these questions to, according to my program, it will be first Natasha and Carl. Natasha?
Great. I think I'll begin by saying that generally across the board, from the conversations I've been having with colleagues all across the continent, is that we notice that most governments, their first instinct was to lead with an iron fist and fear. So the message that Africans were getting is that if you breach these guidelines, you're going to be jailed. So there was a general atmosphere of fear and force, where even though the government was implementing or rolling out rules that citizens needed to comply with, it wasn't from the point of this is for your own good. It was from the point of, if you do not do this, how will you find your way? And so it was devoid of context, and more often than not, quite tone deaf. It failed to take into context the everyday reality of young Africans, or Africans who are just trying to get by. So you would find a lot of Africans would be told, or in the context of Kenya, if you miss curfew, and curfew initially was at 7 p.m., you're going to go straight into quarantine and you're going to pay for it yourself. So there was no message initially of this is for your own good. These are the steps you need to take. So I think the mistake, especially in the context of Kenya, was that instead of informing citizens of why they needed to do this and listening to their feedback, there was sort of a push and force that really did a lot of damage long term, where even those who feared that they had COVID were afraid to come forward. Secondly, we find that the measures that government took mostly affected the middle income, lower income, and middle upper income Kenyans, where even though they reduced the tax obligations, they did it for those who are employed, those who are in formal businesses. And this failed to take into account the larger group of the informal sector and those working in agriculture. So those young people, women who are still working in the informal space, who make up, in the context of Kenya, 69% of workers are in the informal and vulnerable space, were still adversely affected by the negative economic, socioeconomic effects of the current crisis. So while government was focusing on how it could cushion corporates, it could cushion those who are working, it forgot those who are often invisible, living in informal settlements. And we found that also the responses by government have been blind to the gender dynamics. They have failed to take into account how the current crisis has differentially affected the lives of men and women, and more importantly, young men and women in the informal sector and in the rural areas. We find that there has been an upsurge in Kenya in a rise in teenage unplanned pregnancies, which has also led to an increase in unsafe abortions, because these young girls are unable to access the necessary services that will protect them from taking measures that will ruin their lives. But because we have been more reactive than introspective in our approaches, we fail to take into account the measures we are putting in place that could affect the everyday lives of our citizens. Then we get into a space where Africans have gotten to a place where they're slightly desperate. They don't think COVID is that much of a crisis. If you go into the informal sector, they're like, I'm dying anyway. If you go to the slums, I was dying anyway because of poverty. So there's nothing new you're telling me, unless you're gonna tell me I'm gonna be shot today. We find that, and I would like to contextualize and speak mostly around East Africa and what I've been seeing in Kenya. There has been an increase in police brutality, especially in the vulnerable and informal sectors. And this has led to large disgruntlement, especially amongst young Kenyans and young Africans who have been unemployed for the last couple of years, who have been feeling a sense of hopelessness, and who now feel rejected and dejected by their governments and their leaders. So I feel initially there was a negative approach taken by governments. However, we have seen a slight pivot where the governments are realizing, hang on, we haven't taken into account the voices of young people. We haven't taken into account the everyday realities of our citizens. And in the context of Kenya, we are seeing the government now asking, what do we need to do to speak to young Kenyans? And while we are grateful for the slight shift, there's also fear that it may be a bit too late. that some damage has already been done. Some lives have already been lost. There's an increase in teenage pregnancies. How are we going to handle this particular crisis? So while we're still looking back, we need to now repivot, be agile enough to say, look, this is what we need to do to ensure that the challenges we have faced during this particular period, which have been exacerbated, we've been facing them, are going to be dealt with in these few steps. Governments need to be agile enough to think and look ahead. What does the next year look like for Kenya? What does the next year look like for Sudan, for South Africa? We need to put measures in place. And I was in Cape Town in February when the Cape Town government was already putting initiatives in place and doing scenario planning of what the next 2 years were going to look like because of the COVID crisis. In my conversations with the Kenyan government, that hasn't happened yet. We are not yet doing scenario planning of what the future looks like, of how young people's lives are going to be differentially affected. We have just heard from our government that young people are going to be repeating their classes. So instead of going a class forward, next year in 2021, every single young Kenyan is going to be repeating class. What does this mean? What does this mean for the young girls who have to stay home, who are already being abused by those in authority, who are turning to transactional sex as a means of survival? What are they going to be doing between now and January when they get back to school? How are we going to ensure that their lives are safe, that their environments are safe, that young people are not dying from brutality, police brutality? So it's quite important for governments to start thinking about the future. This is what we need to do to ensure that we are mitigating the crisis and the effects of the current crisis in place. Yeah, thank you very much, Mama Graça.
Insights, and I'm glad that this is being recorded, so we will take it word by word. It will help us now to see how we move forward. Thank you, Natasha. Now, can I ask Carl to give his insights?
Thank you very much. And Natasha has set the scene. I think there are 3 areas that I want to add. The first one is around the agility and the creativity of young people across the continent. The second one is around the urban-rural divide that we continue to struggle with in terms of the gap. And the third one is the role of the Africa CDC in bringing us to where we are. So if I think about the first one, in Senegal, there is a Social Change Factory, which is a youth-led organization that has helped in terms of distribution of PPE. In Malawi, we have Chinawale Women's Center for Education. In Mali, we have Accountability Lab, which has ensured that people get the information about COVID-19 in local languages. In Burkina Faso, we have Diagnose Me. In Ghana, we have Solar Wash. All these initiatives were young youth-led initiatives. The gap remains is how do we ensure that the required funding, the required capabilities are helping them, supporting them to increase their market access. Because so often it's not about access to finance, but it's actually access to market, nationally, regionally, and also at continental level. The second one is around the urban and rural. So when I hear that 62% of people are less aware, even though they have the technology that they can get access to, only 51% get the information via radio. What this triggers to me is that young people in urban area need to ensure that they connect with young people in rural area. We know today that internet penetration in Africa, as of data of 2019, stands at 39.6%, compared to 62.7% in the world, which means that a good part of young African and African in general that just don't have access to internet. And if the internet is a medium that we use to communicate, then we have a challenge because we continue to leave a good part of the African population out of information and, most importantly, out of knowledge. My last point is around the Africa CDC. If we look at the data, there is 48% recovery on the African continent. It means that African health workers, those that are on the continent, continue to support the continent as best as they can with limited means. What shall we do to ensure that the Africa CDC, which did not exist when we had the Ebola crisis in West Africa, that has been put in place by the African Union, has adequate resources to continue to support the continent? Jay spoke about Ubuntu and solidarity. The African Union launched a COVID-19 response fund to allow anybody that wants to chip in some money to do so to support the work that is being done on the continent. And I think this is important because the government responded using existing scientific evidence. The virus continues to change, but the reality is that the continent was not set up to actually have a response with lockdowns. Now that we have spent a lot of time with lockdowns, the real question and the gap is how do we move from living without COVID by being in lockdown, but we're living with COVID-19 because it's not going anywhere. And that transition now is actually one of the biggest gaps that we need to address in ensuring that the number of recoveries that we see continue to increase. Thank you, Mark.
You have quite concise, which gives us opportunity then to have much more interaction. And I would invite the other young people, if you have really something you feel very strongly about, just raise your hands. It's not only for this too. You can come in and we share your insights too. I was very struck to hear in such, powerful way to say how there is no constructive communication between governments and citizens. That's how Natasha started. Instead of communicating with people to make them aware that this is in their own good, she used the word of iron fist. I think that's a huge gap, which we should take as a contribution of young people to say, there is no communication in the right sense of the word. There is an attitude of treating citizens as if they are objects. You tell them what to do, you use the strength and the power you have, but you don't engage the citizens. You don't take them to internalize that it's in their own interest where you take certain measures. This is a powerful statement of what is, the relationship between the government and those who are governed. And I think we will take this point to see how we work on it. I think we had also a very strong message of governments ignoring the reality of our nations. When you take measures to support the formal sector and you ignore the informal sector, where the majority of our people, whether they are rural, whether they are women, whether they are young people, the majority of people are in fact in the informal sector. They are not in the formal sector. So when they take measures and they ignore this majority, it raises a huge problem of what is this democracy about? Is it a democracy of minority? It is a negation, in fact, of the very basic principle of a government which is there to serve and to serve everyone. And I think this is also a very strong message which came here. The blindness to gender and the dimensions of this, the police brutality, and what at the end was very comforting to hear from Natasha is the government of Kenya now beginning to ask the question, what can we do with young people? It's not to do for young people, is what the government can do with young people. I think that's an important entry point to begin that dialogue, constructive and meaningful communication, which we felt at the beginning that it was missing. Natasha said, well, it may be too late. So it's important to take that opportunity in a very organized way, in a very articulate way, to inform the government what are the concerns of young people, what are the anxieties, but more importantly, what young people are prepared to make as a contribution to work exactly with government to address all these issues which we have felt now. I think it was not expressed very, very clearly, but we should also take into account that inequalities in our societies have come out in a glaring and dramatic way, exposed by this pandemic. So it is not really to say, how do we start from here to the future, ignoring the reality of we have even given some setbacks. We have taken some steps back to what we have gained, which we have to put in place again if we are to move ahead. Inequality is something which has to be on the cards when we redesign a way forward. And then I was very touched because Carl, you began by saying what young people are doing. And they are there. You gave examples in different countries, and you say they are doing, they are creative, they are productive, they are innovative. What they need is to facilitate the market. And that, of course, there's a role for governments to do. It's not only initiative from young people. And as I said at the beginning, I mean, we are happy to know that this has been recorded, because in our follow-up programs, this is perhaps some of the issues which we should support to facilitate now. At the beginning, I was talking communication with government, but also with the market. I was touched to hear you talking about how young people can even take a role in connecting the urban with the rural. Because yes, it's a government issue, but perhaps in your investments as young people as well, when you invest, you can be creative and see how you connect urban young people who have assets to certain knowledge and certain skills and even resources, how they intentionally do business to connect with other young people in rural areas who are much more disadvantaged. I think here it's what Jay was saying, is how do we take responsibility? It's not only to enumerate the issues, but how do we take responsibility in resolving the problems we face? I think it would be good for young people to come up around the new Now Generation Network, to come with a message of praising the health workers on the continent, as you did. Really, it would be extremely, comforting for those who are on the front line, who are laying their lives in a daily life, you know, to save other lives, to feel that they are young people organized around this network, and perhaps you can bring other networks to praise them, to say, we appreciate, we really recognize the beautiful and powerful way in which you are protecting the lives of Africans. So it is important not only to tell the foundation, but also to find a way of getting this message to health workers themselves. I would like to also suggest that you continue as young people, and perhaps in some scenarios you can draw to say, living with COVID is going to be part of us from now on. Perhaps it's not going to go away for forever. So what we do, and particularly you young people, how do you see our societies living with the COVID, but without a COVID which is killing people, as we do have, other pandemics which we are living with, like HIV. We came to a point where we live with HIV, but people have productive lives, long lives, etc., etc. With COVID, how young people see scenarios in which we live with COVID, but it's not a permanent threat over our heads, one. And second, using science, which is out there, to make the cost of COVID less heavy. I think now I have to pass this to the next session, but I wanted to thank you, young people. You were really very, very clear, very articulate, very constructive, which I think it's extremely important. You didn't only raise issues, but you came also with very concrete proposals of how we should move. This is the investment which Mo, as a person, and the foundation exactly is doing. To invest in young people who take up the responsibility to build, as we say, the Africa we want. Thank you so very much. Now, I take it back to you, Mo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Graça, for very wise words as usual. I've been enjoying this discussion very much, actually. And I'm sorry the time is a little bit compressed and we have to keep rushing. Yeah. Now I'll ask Jendayi then to lead her session. Where we go from here, what the future holds for us, what we should be doing going forward. Jendayi, you are in charge.
Yes, thank you very much, Mo. Thank you for the handoff, and I'm very happy to be part of this roundtable. And in this session, as Mo said, is looking forward. And we're going to talk, I think, to Nasi and Natasha. But really, the survey talks about 84% of the Now Generation Network respondents viewed the crisis as providing a chance to amend and cure policies going forward. The current policies related to health and economics, and really even fundamentally governance. And when you looked at the survey, it says that, you know, they're not overly optimistic. Your network isn't. 7% said that government might, or countries may bounce back strongly. 7% felt that there was a permanent damage, so very pessimistic. But the majority, 49%, felt that countries would recover only after a very hard time. And so what really we want to discuss is, what is that path to recovery? And especially, what role do youth play in it? How are they central to the path of recovery, given that, in fact, you are the majority of these countries? And so I guess I'd start by pointing out and picking up where the survey speaks, talking about one of the recommendations was about ownership, increased ownership, and increased self-sufficiency. And we heard Mandi talk about this, and Hanan as well. And so I wonder, particularly Nasi, with you being in business, what is the path forward getting out of these hard times that can allow Africa to transform itself into more self-sufficiency and greater ownership of the economic space? And Natasha, I would ask you, how, from a governance perspective, because all of this comes back to governance. And again, we said that young people are the majority. So really these governments should be responding to you more than anybody. You are the main constituents. How can you increase that youth involvement and that empowerment and youth-centered policies going forward, leading to the transformation that's necessary to get out of these hard times? So Nasi, I'll start with you first and then come to Natasha.
Sure, thank you so much for the opportunity. I think, you know, this pandemic has been a great leveler. It's affected everyone around the world in more or less the same way. At least the impulse has been the same and the response is really different. When we look at this stat from the survey that Africans seem to be more or less positive or cautiously optimistic about the future, I think it points to this deep hunger for change in some way. And that all the conversations that we've been having before are asking, we're pointing out issues with our governments, with our leadership, with the way our states are run, and we're speaking about specific things that we want. But I think the excitement is by looking at this pandemic as a huge disruptor, one so big that some form of change has to happen. And the impact on the government has been for them to kind of, it's their laundry has been aired out, and it's very clear that they have a job to be done. And so in the past, we've complained that they maybe aren't doing their job. It's now extremely clear, because we've been pushed to some extreme, that the government has to step in and help the people and try and save the day. And so what that outlines is the deficiencies, where we see that we're simply not capable. And I've been based in the UK, I've been on lockdown all this time. I get to see how this government responds to a crisis like this. And so the social support is good because they're able to. They have the kind of governmental balance sheet that allows them to borrow, that they put into initiatives that go to the people, helping people who've lost their jobs, building up the healthcare system, supporting businesses through all of this. And you can look at that and say, that's the right kind of response. That's what we need. That's how you keep your economy stable so that you can come out stronger. And we wish that every government would be able to do that. But sadly, most African governments simply are not capable. They don't have the financial resources. They don't have the ability to borrow the money that they need to get these things done. And so we all have to be creative in these situations. And where in the past, I think the citizenry would almost give up on their government and say, we'll never see any support from them. We'll never see the enablers that we really need. People start empowering themselves and they do things in their community. They build businesses, they try and build jobs. We know all of the deficiencies, but I think the situation is the same now, where people are looking again and saying, I can see what my government is trying to do, I appreciate that they are acting this time, but they can only do so much, and the rest will have to come from us. And what we might be excited about is that in the panic of the government, their inability to sort this problem out, they might turn and look at us and say, hey, how can we do this together? You guys are coming up with initiatives. You're building communication systems in the communities. We can't get food through, so you guys are handling that yourselves. The borders are closed. Our shipments aren't coming in. So maybe we give up on these ideas of relying on the West so much for all of our resources. And we look internally and say, hey, who can take this stuff out to the ground? Who can create this food, and how do we move that around? And maybe we look at our immediate neighbors and start being more friendly amongst African countries and saying, we're in trouble right now. How can you help me with this thing I used to source from America or from China? And convince ourselves that all of these things are possible, that all the solutions that we need might exist on our home ground, and just be forced to make the decisions that we've been asking for a long time, because we have to, because it's panic, because it's pure survival. So I think this takes us down to the fundamentals and the basics of what people need and how governments have to support their people. And it allows us to then focus in on the things we've been asking for a long time. Can we just strengthen our government's balance sheets? Let's not waste so much. Let's put money into the healthcare systems, into the education systems. When people can't go to school, do we ask ourselves the question, what's next, right? So deliver education online. And that's extremely powerful, and that can endure beyond the pandemic because we can then get information out to people. So that's very useful to do. And I think what I'm most excited about and what young people are most excited about is we just feel that this pandemic has been such a large and violent shake to the system that the government will finally have to respond, and it will be more practical than the political interference that we're used to seeing.
Thank you very much, Nasi. And I would just say that it's an opportunity for African entrepreneurs to step in, right, and deliver some of those services, deliver some of those goods, and you know, that's the opportunity that I think you're speaking of. So Natasha?
Yeah, as they say, never let a good crisis go to waste. So I think the first thing I would recommend or suggest is that African governments do an extensive audit. What took place during this particular time? Were our measures effective? Where did we fail? Where did we succeed? Who was most adversely affected by this crisis, and why? What measures did we put in place? What cushions did we put in place? And did we address the needs of the everyday lives of our citizens? So an extensive socioeconomic audit addressing and highlighting the gaps that the policies and legislations need to fill would be an initial step. A second step would be the data, looking at the data, disaggregated data. A lot of governments do not have adequate disaggregated data, telling us the truth about the number of young women who are employed, the number of young men in formal and informal employment, and the gender dynamics of our countries. So it is important for us to look at policy interventions through a data-driven lens, so we are able to effectively address the issues at hand. So first it would be on audit, second, addressing the data gaps that we have in our particular countries. Third, looking at the policies that we have, are they addressing the current needs? I feel, especially in the context of Kenya, we are very trigger happy when it comes to policies. We have great policies. The challenge is in implementation. Policies and legislation are nothing if they're not effectively implemented. So how are we ensuring that once we develop these policies and legislation, that we are actually implementing the same? But before we even get to developing these policies and interventions, who is on the who is sitting on the table and having these conversations? Are they representative and responsive to the needs of young people? The largest demographic in the continent, are we responding to their needs? Are we representing them in conversations? Or are we assuming we know what young people need? So are these policies informed by the visions, perceptions, attitudes of young people? Are we listening to what they're saying, and are we executing the same? And as we develop these conversations and as we look forward, it would be very important for governments to know that they cannot move forward without this particular generation. this is probably going to be the most fundamental generation affecting the next 10 or 20 years of our continent. So how do we ensure that their voices are heard, that we avoid the current disgruntlement? Lastly, the informal sector is the largest sector in the continent. How we are ensuring that we are enabling this sector not only to thrive, to create, to generate wealth, but we are also protecting those who are most vulnerable in these particular sectors. These are women and young children, especially young children who are given employment and who have to seek employment to put foods on their tables, and women who are sexually abused every single day just because they're trying to find different ways to put foods on their table. So when we are addressing the economy, we need to focus largely on the informal sector and ensure that whatever policies, measures, and interventions we are developing and implementing are addressed towards this particular sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we do have a little bit of time left here. So let me just go back to you guys and ask you to drill down even deeper. And I'll start this time with Natasha. Natasha, you were saying that, and this is to you as well, Nasi, and to everyone else. You were saying that you have to ensure that the governments are responsive to the youth and they're responsive and address policies that are implemented that impact the informal sector. Do you see a role for the Now Generation Network in making sure that those governments are responsive? You know, in other words, I'm saying, how do you leverage what you have to achieve the results that you are calling for? You know, and Nasi, I'd ask you the same question on the governance side as well as on the entrepreneurial side and the economic opportunity out of pure desperation. How do you leverage this network? How do you leverage this institution? And how do you leverage the others that you are engaged in and involved with to make that change today? How do you push those governments to that accountability? Natasha and others.
Yeah, well, I think, especially for the Now Generation Forum, having engaged with most of us, we have a space and opportunity to speak not only to the foundation, but to our governance, because most of us are in positions where we normally engage with the private and public sector. So how are we leveraging these particular platforms, the foundation? How are we ensuring that the conversations that we are influencing on the ground actually reflect the everyday realities of ourselves and our fellow comrades in this particular space? So I think there is bandwidth and an opportunity for us to engage. And not only that, just share experiences, document our journeys, document the experiences of Kenya, of Sudan, of South Africa. What has taken place? What can young people do? And what does the future look like for young people? So having more conversations, having more young people joining these particular forums, engaging and putting out information in regards to the visions that we have for ourselves would be a step in the right direction. I'm going to pass the baton over to either Hanan or Nasi to contribute to this particular conversation.
I'm happy to chime in. I think when we look at ourselves as a group of young people, it's this network, and we feel very passionately about many things. But when we speak, we have all these ideas, and it's not always clear how we take those and get them to the people who need to hear them. And it sounds like it's the same from the other end, where leaders might be asking themselves, what do young people want? And so I've always struggled to answer this question, but you know, when you force that conversation to happen and you're really open to listening, I think it's just the transfer of information that really matters, because we sit back and we look at some of the decisions our governments make and they don't make any sense to us. And we think, you have all these consulting firms, these huge teams of people. Did you really do the work to understand what was actually needed? And, you know, we think, but surely they must have, so I must be wrong. Their consultants couldn't have advised them incorrectly, but it simply doesn't make sense. So the very simple thing is to say, can we have that conversation? And maybe this is a nice route to have that, because here we are, a group of people, we know people like you, and you know them. And so you could connect us and we could have that conversation. In terms of how the entrepreneurship can work and can be supportive, we see very nice responses to initiatives or to incentives. So when a government says, hey, we need PPE, we need masks, we need ventilators, people stop what they're doing and they start making, because they see that the customer's there and they're about to buy. You can turn that around and say, as a government or as a country leadership, how do we find out what people are working on and what they really need? Because the saddest thing is you have this group of incredible entrepreneurs, they have initiatives, they have products, they need to get them out, and the money's not there, right? They don't know how to get through that first stage. Investors are asking for something they can only show in 3 years, and how do we bridge that gap? So that just simply needs to be sorted out. And I think if you position yourselves, you know, here in Europe, they have these venture capital firms, they raise the money and then they run around and say, who wants it? And the people that are building the things, show them to them, and that match is made. But in Africa, that's simply, it's always a little bit harder. And so just making kind of clearer and more intentional systems or bits of infrastructure that allow the transfer of information. I am building something amazing and it really could help people. You are looking for something amazing and you could help me get it to the people. If we just allow that conversation to happen, there's amazing economics at every step of the chain. It's good for the country, it's good for the entrepreneur, it's good for the future. And I just think it's the right way forward. So I don't have a very good answer on this, but I think improving communication between the groups is helpful.
No, I think that's excellent, both of you. And I understand, Mandy, you have your hand up? Oh, Hanan, you have your hand up.
Just my quick 2 cents on that. I agree with everything that you're saying. And an ideal scenario, this is what would happen. But I feel that sometimes African leaders aren't accountable, and there's high levels of corruption and lack of governance and poor implementation. Although they do have an interest in pursuing, you know, economic development initiatives, at the same time, they're very, how can I say this? They don't have the best interest of, you know, marginalized groups of society or society as a whole, maybe their own ethnic group or their cronies or their political party. So I think that's an issue, and I don't know how to address that issue. And as much as we can have these dialogues and conversations, sometimes I feel like it really falls on deaf ears. And I think going forward, in terms of youth, I think youth entrepreneurship is definitely a way forward, and just learning how to empower youth and giving them access to skills and finance and opportunities to develop and accelerate their businesses, and you know, just cross-border trade within Africa. I think these are the ways that things will really change, because I don't think that from a leadership standpoint, they can only do so much. And I think that it takes our own initiatives to actually drive things forward, because there is a level of, there's not as much as accountability that you can rely on them for addressing a lot of these issues that we want to see happen.
True. I guess what I would add here, and we're going to also bring in Carl, because I see that your hand is up, is that, you know, as a political scientist and a person who's been in government, the one thing I always say is governments aren't monolithic, right? They just aren't. And so there's always avenues and ways into accountability to get accountability from decision makers. Because if you treat governments as monolithic, they're all unaccountable, because they're unaccountable to some constituency for sure, right? And the great equalizer that young people have today is the digital world. It can actually counteract money, because, you know, the interest in politics is by your influence with your money. But if you can actually reach a broad amount of people through digital means, you know, through your social media, et cetera, then you have organizational power that then you can use to actually hold those governments more accountable. You know, you have constituents within your parliament. And I think, Natasha, I loved what you said about how you reached out and learned lessons from each other. I just think about the Black Lives Matter movement when it was facing police brutality in this country. reached out to the people in Hong Kong to figure out how do you actually, counter this brutality to maintain your movement going forward. And so, that network is within Africa, and it's also global. And there are also allies within government, right? There's corrupt people within government, and you also have allies within government, and you also have local constituents, because most of these countries do have parliaments today. And so there are ways, Sudan, the People's Revolution is an inspiration for everybody. It's not to say you have to take it through the streets, but if you only have the streets to take it, so then therefore do it that way. But there's so many ways, and I think that power of inspiration and communication that both Nasi and you, Natasha, talked about, and Hanan, that you pointed to requiring, I think is really a powerful tool that you have in your hands, and that all of the successful movements in the past have all used. And the civil rights movement and the anti-colonial movement was a communication. It was a global network that built on each other's success and each other's lessons. So with that, Carl, you wanted to contribute?
Just wanted to add that there are 1.3 billion of us on the continent. Not all of us are in government, but we have something which is important. How do we make sure that the life of a woman selling in the market can improve every day? That implies that a young person, you have to make that effort of asking yourself that question and taking the steps. It means going to buy in the market, for example, ensuring that if she doesn't have access to a good refrigeration system because she's selling fish or meat, you find a way to ensure that she can get access to that. That's also talking to not always government that are sitting in central, but speaking to the mayor. And how can we help the mayor to improve the local market? Those are some of the changes that are incremental and I think are more sustainable. Government will respond to these initiatives because they realize that we have actually taken a step to help them. We should also start looking not always top down, but also laterally. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent point. And Mandi, did you have something that you wanted to contribute here?
Sorry about that. I think I was disconnected. I'll just race through it very quickly because I know we're out of time. So we said there's a lot of talk about innovation, but there's nothing really done. And we thought about a solution, and we said, we have this network base. And this goes back to your original question about what can we do to leverage the networks that we have currently. So we sat down, and without even thinking about it, without even realizing it, 21 of the experts that we had from 15 African countries, we came up with a list of 21 people, and almost 90% or 80% of those people were from the Now Generation Forum. So you have people talking about women in STEM, the future of democracy, you have members of parliament, you have people at Facebook talking about infrastructure development with their two Africa initiative. You have people from Access Now talking about managing information and internet shutdowns. You have education, you have sustainable economic development, you have food insecurity, smart cities, unemployment, healthcare, activism, and the list could go on, and the diaspora community. So it's about engaging that. And once Carl spoke about Accountability Lab and what they're doing. And I managed to link Accountability Lab with UNICEF and the chatbot that they're doing, because we interviewed the country director in Mali. And UNICEF came up with a chatbot, and that was linked to South Sudan. So without even realizing it, these networks had a ripple effect on themselves. And I think that's a great starting point in and of itself. And people are watching. My constituency is not necessarily yours, but when you merge those together, real change can be affected. And just a comment, just a fleeting comment, just as I wrap up, on the need to engage government. I think, as much as we want government to politicize livelihoods and to understand that the return on investing in their citizens is greater than the disinvestment and deflecting that they're currently doing, it's really important that we realize the agency that we have in and of ourselves as young people to enact that change as well.
Thank you very much. On that point, I think it's an outstanding one. I enjoyed the discussion. It's really, I think, very rich, and I will turn it back to Mo.
Well, thank you very, very much, Jendayi. I really thank you all. I think this has been a wonderful and rich discussion. In trying to wrap up, I'm not going to repeat any of the wonderful points which has been said. Maybe I just mention a few things which was not said, but looking at the whole problem from a distance, I think I would like to start to say that I'm really surprised till now about the situation of Corona in Africa, because at the beginning, we thought we're going to see a massive disaster. The number so far in Africa doesn't show that. I mean, I was looking to this morning. I mean, the latest number is about 500,000 infections over the last period, the whole period. Unfortunately for South Africa, is 40% of this in South Africa, over 200,000, unfortunately, in South Africa, followed by Egypt, which is about 80,000. Between them, that is over 60% of all infections in Africa. I don't know why. Nobody is able to answer my questions. We talk to experts, we talk to people, and everybody's scratching their head. Some people say, oh, Africa's young population. So statistically, it doesn't work out. Some people say, oh, lack of data. Some people, no, but we can see the number of deaths. We don't understand, and of course, it's a new virus, and people don't understand fortunately for us African, the virus doesn't seem to like us, and we're very happy, and we hope it stays like that. So we have been rather fortunate in this occasion, and we wait. I mean, WHO warns about a possible tsunami hitting us in October or November. I don't know. We're cautiously optimistic. So that's one thing I wanted to mention. Another thing which is a little bit unusual, because I'm usually critical of the African governments, but I think in this occasion, many African governments really acted responsibly. And I think we should be objective and honest enough to say, well, actually, they performed much better probably than the British government, how it responded, or the Brazilian government, or even the United States government. People try to take action early on. I mean, I read a very strange account of a UN worker who flew to South Sudan, and his story was, when I arrived in Juba, somebody took my temperature and they asked me to fill a form, where I come from, where I'm going, give me a phone number to contact you for a problem. Through the process. South Sudan is a failed state, to be honest. I mean, and for people to act like that, and then she said, I stayed for a week, finished my job, and I flew back. I think she went back to Denmark through Brussels. She passed through 2 major European airports. Nobody asked her where she came from, where she is going. Nobody took any numbers. She just walked through and said, how come South Sudan is taking this seriously, but Brussels and Denmark are not taking this seriously? I think there's something in that story. So I believe the majority of African governments behave responsibly. And so we must accept that. The one thing worries me, frankly, is that we are all obsessed with COVID. Yes, it's a major threat, but we have other threats, and I hope we don't lose sight of them. Locusts are playing havoc with agriculture in East Africa, threatening really a major famine there. And there's no spotlight on that issue. Because maybe we're going to lose more people because of hunger than the disease itself. Again, I think we lose the ball when it comes to other diseases. Malaria killing more people than the virus. And we're not, I think, paying enough attention there, or other diseases. And this is not limited to Africa. This is happening also. I mean, I'm aware of UK because I spent more time in UK. It has been a disaster. All the patients of cancer, no treatment. They're kicked out of hospitals because they wanted to clear the hospitals for the patients of coming, and a lot of deaths there. Then what happened in the home care for the elderly people? It was absolute disgrace because they just chanted people there, and they did not even provide them with kit, with anything, and a huge number of deaths among the elderly people in the home. So for governments have to look at the whole picture, to lose sight of what's going on and just focus on one when you can be hit with something else there, it can be a problem. I think we need to have a balanced view of all these threats to us. Finally, to question of going forward, I feel that the economic threat to Africa probably is far greater to us than the health threat, which for some reason we don't seem to fare badly there. But the economic threat is serious because most African countries are expected to really go into recession. Governments hasn't got the fiscal space to do what the guys in developed countries have done. There is trillions of dollars is being paid out to business to stop them firing or furloughing workers. People, the citizens will say, oh, you go stay at home and we send you your salary at home. For many people, it was a wonderful vacation to stay with their family and get paid. Economically, at least, it was fine. We don't have the fiscal space. We don't have the resources to do that. So what is going to happen to us as we're going forward? How many businesses are going to go bankrupt? How many people are going to go unemployed? With unemployment is already a big problem for us. This is a major concern. Very little, unfortunately, has been done for that. At the beginning, there were some movements, and Ramaphosa, as the chair of the African Union, he showed some early leadership there in trying to get African leaders together and to put the case on the international stage in order to raise support. G20 said African debt, we move it, with the interest, we'll postpone it to the end of the year. We'll get to, it's not debt forgiveness, it's delayed until, for this year. This is not enough. This is ridiculous because the interest we need to pay on debt, not the debt, the interest is about $44 billion this year. $44 billion. And what G20 did is said the public debt will be moved on. That is only 12 billion. So what about the rest of the debt? No movement there. That's private debt. No movement there. And even the 12 billion, which is being deferred for December, is not enough because we need a deferment at least for a couple of years for the government to have some fiscal space in order to deal with the challenge. So this was a big problem. Second issue, that talk about sovereign debt. What about private companies? What happened to businesses? There's no support to businesses. And there have been some attempts, and we discussed that in the board meeting in our foundation 2 days ago. There's some proposals by Vera from the Economic Commission of Africa, which we're pushing through. We're trying to see some innovative, not really that innovative, but to deal with the issue of debt, etc. Basically, Africa has as an African country, you go and borrow money, you end up paying a huge amount of interest rate because your rating is very low actually. You're not investment grade. But it's possible to create vehicles which can have a higher grade of investment and to get a low interest rate to pass it on. I mean, it is simple. and you can see all that stuff. So we need to move in that. We need to speak with that. IMF, everybody recognizes IMF has a huge amount of power. They can produce up to $600 billion in what they call SDRs, special drawing rights, without even going to the shareholders. It can be done. And Kristalina Georgieva will speak to her. She seemed to be, yes, we'll do it. But where is the beef? Nothing happened yet. Those guys have a huge amount of power in order to help African countries really cross that bridge. So this is an area we need to continue campaigning and raising, because there are things we ask our leaders to do. There are things we ask the international community to do, which is not tough. It's very simple, and is less than 0.5% of the financial commitment made by the developing countries. The huge financial commitments made by developing countries, we are asking for less than 0.5% of that to be made to emerging markets. Anyway, I hope I do not talk too much, but I thought to just try to fill in around the discussion and link the African effort with the internet, what we need to do, what our partners hopefully will do, etc. Now, if this forum you think is useful going forward, we need to think how to improve this. And I still think we need to have more people, even as, as guests. You don't have to be in the panels, but in order to spread the word around, and also we need to connect this. Graça said something more important. I mean, we have 250 people here. That's not enough. We need to connect this with wider networks and wider, because we need millions of people to be part of these movements in Africa. So you need also to connect your own networks and look at other people to come together and to see how we really develop a good dialogue among the young people, because you are a political force which can be very important in driving the policies in Africa. With that, I shut up and thank you very much. And Zainab, do you have anything to add before we say goodbye to everybody?
No, Mo, I just want to say thank you very much for such an insightful conversation. It's really interesting to hear the perspectives that came out of the survey, and of course the complimentary comments that were made here. We will do our very best to we will be turning this video promptly and make sure we disseminate as widely as possible. And this Now Generation network is just the beginning of something really powerful.
Okay, guys, thank you very much. My love to all of you, and
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, and bye-bye.